Hi, I'm Jay Worden. I'm the Director of Focal Point Ministries, and I'm here with Pastor Mike Fabarez. And we're going to spend some time looking at apologetics, looking at those questions that Christians get inevitably every day that we have to answer regarding our faith. And so I thought the first place to start would be, how do we know there's a God? You know, I was looking at a recent Gallup poll, and to the answer to the question of, do you believe in God, 92% of the people answered yes.
Right.
And yet we've got this vocal few who seem to make us feel like everybody in the world doesn't believe in a God. How do we respond to those people? What do we think about that, first off?
You can look in any book on the countries of the world and flip the pages, and every country of the world, you're going to have statistics on religion because the world believes in God. Right? That is what has always been. Some people believe that religion has evolved. Samuel Zwimmer, for instance, did a 50-year study on the origins of religion, and it's just not true. It's been a universal belief in God as far back as we can go in all the anthropological studies. And even today, with everyone talking about atheism, it's almost cool to be an atheist. And I say that because some of the stats just don't bear out. 50% of atheists today in a Barna poll said that they believe in a heaven and a hell. That's 50% of the people that say they don't believe in a God, and they know there's no God, believe there's a heaven and hell. More than that, 13% say if you get right with Jesus Christ, you can secure a place in heaven. So here are people believing in the message of the gospel, in essence, and still saying, I don't believe in God. So believing in God, is a universal belief. I know there are some that would say that they don't, but they get a lot of airtime in our culture, and it's almost cool to join that group of contrarians, the folks that are going to go against the grain of what everybody else believes, and they write their books and people buy them, and certainly a lot of it is a reaction to their frustration with Christianity or theism in general, but it's not a universal thing, and I don't think it ever will be. We are innately wired to believe in God because there is a God.
You said that we innately understand or know there's a God. I was looking at Ecclesiastes 3:11 where it says we've got eternity set in our hearts. So talk a little bit about that, how we know innately that there's a God.
Right. Well, certainly the evidence fits the facts. I mean, there's a God. He's created us in his own image, and we have hardwired within our spirits this understanding of God. As a matter of fact, some of the great definitions in Encyclopedia of Religion, for instance, this great work says, no matter where you go to define the God of the world, the sky God, or whatever you want to call him, the definition, this author says, is in essence, it's the same. And that is that there's an all-powerful, transcendent being who makes everything, is in charge of everything. And the Bible says, for instance, in Romans chapter 1, that one of the reasons we want to run from that is that there's built-in accountability. If there is a God who has made us, then he owns us. If there's a God who is sovereign and overseeing everything, then his rules go and ours don't. We can't be free from that. So Romans 1 says we suppress the truth in unrighteousness. We know, as Paul says, things that are in this creation, they speak loudly to God and who he is, and we want to run from that because we want to be free. To put it in the terms of Psalm 2, we want to be unfettered from his bondage, right? If he says it's wrong to do this or it's right to do that, we don't want any of that. And innately, as sinners, we're not only created in God's image, but we're fallen people created in God's image. We want to run from that authority.
Captains of our own soul.
Captains of our own soul, right? Masters of our own fate. Or just, it's the kids when the teacher walks out of the room, It goes crazy when we're in elementary school, right? There's that sense, and junior high and high school, there's that sense in which we don't want that authority. And when God creates the world, and he sets this up and he puts people in the world who now rebel against that leadership, you've got people fighting that. But what's amazing, as you said at the outset, 90+% of the people still admit it. They just work hard at kind of reshaping that God. And those that are going to push in society, there is no God. 9 times out of 10, this is not a purely intellectual discussion, though I know it's often cloaked in that. It's what's driving that is a moral discussion. I don't want to be subject to an all-powerful creator, sovereign person who will hold me accountable for my life.
You mentioned at the beginning of that answer about creation, and God being a creator, so creating us and not only the world. And I've heard you give examples about some of the intricacies and amazing just facts about not only in our universe but our bodies. Share a little bit about that and what that means in terms of creator and creation.
Yeah, and it's increasingly difficult because today the theory has been that we Christians just believe in a God that is necessary because of the things we don't understand in science or physics or whatever it might be. They call him the God of the gaps, and they think that that's kind of what we're doing. We don't understand the thunderstorms in the olden days, of course. Well, then there must be a God that's lashing out of the clouds. And if we don't understand something about the stars, then we have to explain this with God. That's not the case. We as Christians believe God is needed for the whole thing. I mean, for all of it. He creates it. He sets it up. He's the one who makes sense of it all. And that's why it does fit together so well. And we don't have time in a video like this to deal with the whole spectrum of creation evolution. But suffice it to say in this conversation that we believe in a God who creates things with instantaneously, with an appearance of a history it never had. I mean, that's the way Jesus came on the scene and created everything he did. He turns water into wine, a very complex molecular structure, and he does it with a word. And that's the whole point in 2 Peter 3, that God creates with a word, he destroys and judges with a word, and he does this all in a way that expresses his glory, whether in judgment or in creation. God is a God who is a God who's reflected in all that. As Isaiah 6 says, the whole world is full of his glory, reflects it. Some of the things you've heard me preach on over the years, and there's lots of examples. Of course, we can look at the human body, and there's lots of people that talk about that. Of course, evolutionists say, well, that's all just adaptation. But there are certain things that are just very difficult for us, even as ardent skeptics, to try and explain away. The one I've thrown out recently is the size of the moon. Here we are on the surface of the Earth. We've got this big satellite around the world. It's hard enough to understand how a satellite that size can even find its place in orbit around our Earth. But here it is 400 times closer to us than the sun, and also 400 times smaller than the sun, so that we, on the surface of the planet, look up to the moon and it appears the exact same size in terms of the disk shape in the sky. There are so many things like that you can look at that rarely do we celebrate in 8th grade science books, because they defy explanation. They become an amazing series of coincidences, right? What a coinkydink that here we have, something that just happens to be perfectly orchestrated. Not only a planet that sustains life, but the glory of God and the handiwork of God seen everywhere. That is evidence to us externally of a God. We have internal evidence in our own hearts. We see his imprint on our spirit. We have to fight that to shoo that out of our hearts. And we look around in the world and we see the glory of God everywhere. And as it's put very simply in Hebrews, every house has a builder, and the builder of this creation we live in, the builder of everything, is God. There's a God, a designer, who designs very intricate things and has made these things by the power of his word that now have an appearance in history, have an appearance of a history, an age that they never had. That's the way Christ showed his position as creator, and that's how God created the world. And that's why science and religion in that regard are not in conflict. Only theoretical science is in conflict with Christianity. But real science is not in conflict with Christianity, because real science simply observes the things that God has created and draws the kinds of laws together on paper. They give voice to those things that God has made to not only sustain the world, but the rules that God made for the world to function in.
Well, that's helpful. Now, as we're talking to our neighbors, or we're in our workplace and we're trying to share the gospel and talk about God with our neighbors, what can we expect through that? What kind of confidence does that give us?
Well, yeah, it should give us some confidence, but I think we need to understand the context of what's happening normally. When the issue of evolution, creation, or God not existing comes up, we generally have people, let's be real frank, not wanting to become like us. They look at our lives and they say, well, you don't do these things that are fun, and you don't run to these parties with us or whatever, and I don't want my freedom restricted. I don't want to be like you. But in reality, we need to recognize when we're sharing the truth of the gospel, the Spirit of God has made the person we're sharing with. hasn't remade them yet as a born-again Christian, but has designed their heart. The Spirit of God testifies. Their conscience testifies to what we're saying. And normally the issue of atheism or the issue of evolution or whatever it might be comes up as an excuse. And the way you can kind of ferret that out in a conversation is simply to ask the person you're talking to, hey, if I could answer every question to your satisfaction regarding paleontology and the history of the world or science or anything, quantum mechanics, if I answered everything to your satisfaction, would you become a Christian today? Would you put your trust in Jesus Christ and become a follower of Jesus today? And the answer, 9 times out of 10, when I ask that question, is no. Yeah. Okay, well then I know that this is an academic discussion that really is going to go nowhere. Not that we should end the conversation, but it sure helps me to recognize that we've left the evangelistic thread, right? And now we're really dealing with, something that usually isn't going to go anywhere.
Back to the will.
Back to the will. This is like, is this real? Do you really not believe there's a God? Or is this, just a reason for you not to submit to the lordship of Christ? And I'm sure as we'll talk in future videos, there's so many other things. We've got the Bible we've got to deal with, a supernatural book filled with predictive prophecies. I mean, we've got all kinds of issues that we have to come to grips with. The ministry of Christ, His death, His resurrection, the testimony of that. All of those things are going to argue toward people being put under the lordship of Christ, as it's put in Psalm 2, since I mentioned that. Kiss the Son, right? Lest He be angry. In other words, make peace with God, because He's either going to be your Savior and your Lord and your deliverer, and one day you'll rejoice in that, or He's going to be your judge. And so we need to just know what's happening in our evangelism. Recognize that people often are just making excuses, and it's good to know whether I'm dealing with someone who really, is making an excuse or has a sincere question. And sometimes I've had the answer. It may not be 1 out of 10. It may be more like, 4 out of 5. But occasionally I'll have someone say, yeah, if I could really get over this issue of believing in a God I can't see, well, then I would become a Christian. Or if I could really get past this whole thing that science teachers keep telling me, there's no way there can be a God because evolution is fact. If I could get past it, I would become a Christian. Those are conversations I really want to just sit down and have those lengthy conversations, continue to meet as frequently as I can, because you've got someone that God is obviously working on and they're honestly seeking answers. And that's where these kinds of discussions can be super helpful.
Yeah. Well, we'll definitely get to those kinds of questions here in the future videos. And thank you for being here and answering that question on how we can know there's a God. And we look forward to seeing you next time.